For my journal club entry this week in OT 528, I chose an article that was incredibly relevant to what we talked about yesterday in class. The title of it is Development and Preliminary Reliability of the Functional Upper Extremity Levels, or FUEL, as we learned yesterday. It was published in 2015 in AJOT, or the American Journal of Occupational Therapy. It was authored by a large group of researchers, the lead of which is Van Loo and Geller et al. The type of research I would more identify, never really said in the actual study itself, in the article itself, but I would definitely qualify it as a qualitative study. All of the information gathered, all the data collected was all through interviewing, educating, asking questions, and face-to-face interviews and surveys and things like that. So I would definitely consider it a qualitative study. As far as the participants go, there were 44 participants. Now, this study is a little bit different than I think a lot of the ones that I've read in many of the OT journals. I actually thought it was incredibly interesting because the participants were licensed OTs. Varying from 6 months of experience to 16 years of experience. All of these OTs, I should say, were specialists in neurological rehabilitation. So obviously they've worked a lot with stroke patients, which the FUEL is used for. So the methods was broken down into two different versions, or two different phases it describes. The first of which is primarily interviewing. This was used basically asking the participants, the OTs, if they've used FUEL, what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, what it did good, what it maybe needs some improvement on, the classifications, whether the classifications they thought were defined clearly, the levels were appropriate, all these just basically simple questions with people who may or may not even have experience with the FUEL module, the FUEL tool. Some of the specific questions that or the topics of questions that it may have asked were about the levels, the definitions of each level, and the qualifiers of each level, and whether they thought that they were appropriate for the level of function, semi-function, gross function, whatever. So they were asked specifically about the levels, definitions, qualifiers. They were also, this was something I'm going to bring up some more in the critique of the article in a little bit, but it also said that they asked 5 external experts to assess the tool on the practicality, the clarity, and the simplification, or the simplicity of the FUEL, which I thought was kind of funny because they did mention that they asked the 44 participants, but they also bring in this weird 5 external experts, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes and how that was kind of weird. But basically interviewing, questioning, asking people, do they work? Does it not work? What do you like? What do you don't like about the FUEL? Is it something you use every day or something you use on special occasions? Now, the second phase of this study, and we'll talk about the results in just a second, but the second phase was more educating and practically using the FUEL in a simulated environment. So it's kind of funny, they took 44 experienced OTs and kind of put them through a practical situation. So that was kind of funny to read it that way. But so the second phase used the tool, or the FUEL tool, in order to, in inpatient and outpatient environments for assessing ADLs. And specifically feeding, grooming, and dressing, and some other ones. And what they would do is kind of like what we use on our simulation videos. They would do the same. They showed videos in the congregation of OTs, and they would ask them to rate their performance with the FUEL tool, whether they were semi-functional, functional, gross functional, normal, whatever. Again, these OTs had some experience of 6 months to 16 years. And something else that they did that I thought maybe was a little bit different was they gathered participants who either had or didn't have experience with FUEL. It was not it wasn't an inclusion factor of whether they had experience with it or not. So we're having 44 OTs, some who had experience with Fuel Tool and some who didn't. So I guess their attempt at trying to equalizing this was before they played the videos in the second phase of this study, they had like a 2-hour lecture on how to use fuel, what it's used for, and kind of a little bit of the assessment history and use before they actually asked these OTs to use it for the videos and to rate these people in the videos, which I thought was maybe that was a practical way of doing it, but it kind of seems like you would include the experience in the inclusion or exclusion factors of the study, which it never was. So I guess the one good thing is to say that when they brought all these 44 participants in, that they at least had a base level knowledge of what the fuel was and how to use it. They weren't going in on it blind. But again, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they were all neurological rehabilitation experts, so they at least had that. They at least had that in there somewhere. And so the primary factor of what they were trying to measure in the second phase, regardless of what these people or the participants had to say in the first phase of whether they used it, didn't use it, liked it, didn't like it, was the inter-rater variability. Now, we've talked about inter-rater variability before in our discussions in class, and that's the variations between two people measuring or using the assessment tool. So just to use this as an example, if I was to use the fuel and somebody who had experience using the fuel, we would probably have very varying differences in the way that we would rate a particular person in their ADL or occupational performance. So what the second phase of this was to do was to test how much these scores varied and how much these ratings varied between the different participating OTs. And they found that the inter-rater variability was only 0.754, which really isn't that great of a variation from what the authors were saying. So it really kind of proves that the fuel tool is a productive and quite effective use of or use as a tool inside post-stroke patients. So that's kind of the main point of the study, was to decide, is it reliable? Is it a trustworthy tool? Is it a tool that maybe we could continue to use, or is it something that needs to be brought to the drawing boards? So it proved to be reliable. It proved to not have very much variation, except on one of the videos, which was the grooming video. The grooming video, they reported having a much different variation in that one particular video over the rest of the ADL videos, which there was 4 of that I mentioned earlier. So they kind of discussed this in the article, explaining how maybe that was a video fault and not necessarily a fault of the tool itself. They were explaining how maybe the variations in the video was kind of on the line of being semi-functional to functional. So this is something that they would definitely want to retest in the future. But they, other than that, there showed to be very little variations in the OT participants in the way that they rated these different videos, which I thought was actually probably not that bad a result, considering the fact that you have 44 OTs, some have 6 months experience, some have 16 years of experience, some of them have used the fuel tool and some of them haven't, and you're still getting pretty similar results. So I didn't think that was too bad. Now, for some of the critiques, I love this article. I love looking up articles and reading research on the reliability of the tools that we use. And I say this because as somebody who does this inside the personal training, I use similar kind of like tools to measure people with. And I like to know how reliable it is and which ones I'm going to bother with and which ones I'm not. So I love getting to do this for OT as well. But there were some critiques about this study that I think that probably could have been done better. And I'm not saying it's not a trustworthy study. I just think that there could have been some extra rules placed on the inclusive and the exclusive factors that maybe would have made the results a little bit more reliable. With that being said, though, I do think that they should have split up participants and maybe even use 2 participant groups on whether they had use of fuel or didn't have use of fuel. So whether they had used it in the past or didn't use it as past, I think you could split it up that way. Or you could split it up between people who have less than a year of experience or less than 5 years of experience and OTs who have more than 5 years of experience. And you could split it up that way. I personally think that the breaking it down of people who have used fuel and who haven't used fuel would be a more effective and productive way. But either way I think would work. And I think you would have more substantial data collection that you could compare with each other, maybe than just throwing them all in one group and getting a little bit more outliers and deviations that way. So I think maybe that was a more productive way of doing it, that maybe in another version of this research could be done better. I also think that the 5 external experts that were mentioned and consulted about the reliability, the clarity, the simplicity of using the fuel tool, I think that was kind of weird. I feel like you should have either named who they are, named what their expertise were, or maybe just not ask them and keep it within your participant group. I'm not really sure. I read the whole thing and never found any more clarification on who those 5 external experts were. Maybe this is something used in research a bit more that I don't know about, but I've never ran into that. I thought that was kind of different. Now, as far as relevance go, obviously it's like breaking news for us. And in fact, I think that's one of the reasons it was most interesting to us, is because we just learned about fuel and now we're seeing that it's, regardless of the differences in the studies, that it's a really reliable tool to use. I think even though there are several critiques that I have about it, I don't see any significant variations in the ratings or in the scoring of the participants. So it seems to be a trustworthy article, though I think in the future there could definitely be better studies that are done to prove otherwise, or prove to either affirm it or deny it. The generalizability, I wouldn't say it's the most general thing. It's specifically for the fuel tool. So if you're not someone working with post-stroke patients, then maybe this isn't something to read for you. So in that kind of aspect, it is a pretty niche study. But in the clinical importance, of course it's important. We're testing our own tools. We're not just taking tools and being like, yeah, it's always been that way, but we're consistently as an occupation, as a career, and as a field, going back and testing our tools and making sure they still work and making sure they're still up to date and making sure they're still as reliable as they used to be when they were affirmed in the first place. So yeah, I think that's something that's super important for us to do, is go back on some of our assessment tools and look back and see if their reliability still holds up to the new rigors of the scientific community and our career and the changing standards of OT. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like consistently checking up on our tools is an important thing for us to do as therapists and as a field. And then finally, the implications, it's made to better the tools used for neurological rehabilitation practitioners. And I think that's absolutely important and implicative for us as OTs, especially if you want to work with stroke patients. And then I've already mentioned it, but to close and to kind of finish up here, I think the most interesting part of this is that it's breaking news for us. Like, we have never heard of fuel, or at least I've never heard of fuel until this week. And here I am reading by somebody else's hand that it's still a reliable tool, and it should be something that we shouldn't feel afraid to use or kind of iffy about using. And not only that, but I love reading articles about the verification and validation of the tools that were taught in class. So I thought that was super cool. That's all I got for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it taught you something, and I look forward to talking to you in the discussion. Bye.